Well, good afternoon, everyone from Boston, Massachusetts. My name is Elaine Popoulias. I'm the Executive Director of the Gunsberg Center for European Studies, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to commence today's event, Challenges and Opportunities for the Biden Administration. I want to thank you all for joining us and extend a warm welcome to our speakers and to our co-organizers at this Southeast European Studies Center at Oxford, CSOX, and in particular, its director, Othon Anastasakis, who is my co-convener today. Othon, it's a pleasure to join you in bringing this event to fruition today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and indeed it's a great pleasure. Delighted that we are doing this jointly, CSOX and the MINDA, the Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard. With Elaine, we go a long way back in organizing events together, having academic exchanges or joint research. But this is our first online joint event, and we are both delighted to welcome you all in a great panel to be discussing the impact of the Biden administration in Southeast Europe. The topic we chose to discuss is obviously very topical, very important, and amenable to a lot of speculations and risks. We are looking at the first signals of the Biden administration during the first days in office and speculating on the prospects in a region which is still a very uncertain and vulnerable part of the European continent, where we have unsolved problems, security problems among states, where we have recently witnessed non-papers appearing to be condoning new borders and new national projects by various extreme nationalist circles, where the rise of illiberalism is a wider kind of feature in many countries of Southeast Europe in terms of strong executives or control of media or control of judiciary, and following a period of tense transatlantic relationship during the Trump years. So with the advent of the Biden administration, we may have some promising signs for the future in several areas, security, political, and transatlantic. So we are asking our three distinguished speakers today to address these issues and whether the Biden administration is going to make any difference and what kind of difference on issues security like Bosnia or Kosovo, or the future, the present and future of cooperation between the EU and the US, or what's going to happen with the current populist regimes and how the US is going to stand in view of this political issue. So for this purpose, we are delighted to host our three excellent speakers. I will very briefly present them, and you will see that they are really second to none in terms of discussing those issues. We will start with Thomas Countryman, who served for 35 years as a member of the US Foreign Service until 2017, having been Undersecretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. Then Tom also worked before in Department Office for Eastern European and Yugoslav Affairs. He was Director of the State Department's Office of South Central European Affairs and Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs with responsibility for Balkan matters. And he's been in embassies, Belgrade, Cairo, Athens, and Rome. Valerie Hopkins was, up until recently, the Southeast Europe correspondent for the Financial Times, covering Hungary, Romania, Albania, and the former Yugoslavia from 2017 until last week. And we can all congratulate Valerie because she will become the correspondent of New York Times in Moscow. Before joining Financial Times, Valerie had also been a freelancer, writing a lot about the Balkans, in very famous outposts like Balkan Investigative Reporting Network or the Organized and Corruption Reporting Project. And her writings have appeared in many newspapers, but she's also, understand, a polyglot in the regional languages. And then Ivan Vejvoda, head of Europe's Futures Program at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, as a permanent fellow. Before he was a senior vice president for programs at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Between 2003 until 2010, he served as executive director at the German Marshall Fund Trust for Democracy, a project which was dedicated to strengthening democratic institutions in Southeast Europe. And before that, he had a distinguished service for prime ministers in Serbia, like Zoran Djindjic and Zoran Živković. Ivan, a long career and very well known, but for all of us, what is very important for him is his dedication in democracy and his role, important role as democratic opposition in the years of Milosevic in Serbia. The session is recorded. I will be chairing the first session of the presentations of our three speakers, and I would like to ask you, please, to write your questions to the Q&A box. Elaine then will take over and manage the question and answer session. And with this, I would like to ask Tom to start with his views on the role of the US in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Othon, and thank you, Elaine, for this opportunity. It's an honor to be here with Valerie and Ivan, both of whom know the region better than I do and follow it more actively today than I do. What I can contribute is the fact that I'm applying all the skills I learned as a diplomat in other countries to try to understand the domestic politics and the foreign policy of the United States. And with that in mind, I can offer a little bit of thought on where the United States is going in Southeast Europe. The United States certainly has goals. It certainly has an approach. It may be too much to ask to say that it has a strategy or a plan for realizing all of those goals. But the important thing to note is that the aims of the United States in this region have not substantially changed in more than 20 years. The overall goal is to support the aspirations of the countries of the region for membership in Euro-Atlantic institutions, that is the European Union, and for those who desire it, NATO membership as well. Now, always there is a subset of the goal, and one that it's better not to talk about often, and that is to prevent any recurrence of violent conflict in the region. The chances of that seem small today, but on any unresolved issues, the risk always remains there. That's the overall aim of what the US has been trying to do with fairly good consistency and very mixed results for more than 2 decades. But let me put 2 things into context. One, it would be a gross and inaccurate simplification to say that the Biden administration is more anti-Serbian or pro-Kosovo or anti-this or anti-pro-that than the Trump administration. It is understandable that leaders such as Trump, Vučić, Orban, Erdogan, Duterte have an affinity for each other given their views about what a functioning democracy means. But that does not reflect the fact that the Biden administration has, I think, an equal commitment to the aspirations of all the countries in the region to build stronger, more prosperous, more free societies and become part of the European mainstream. At the same time, it's important to put these goals in the context of what is the leitmotif of the Biden administration, which is to repair the credibility of America's alliances and to repair the credibility of America among its allies, both of which were heavily damaged during the Trump years. So within that context, establishing a partnership in particular with the European Union, as well as with the individual states of Europe, is the direction that we want to see the United States go. Now, in fact, I think there's been an exaggeration about a divide between the European Union and the United States during the Trump years. There certainly were a couple of differences, and certainly Mr. Grinnell, who has the same kind of warm and honest personality as Mr. Trump did, caused there to be some tensions. But in fact, on most issues, Brussels and Washington continued to work well, contributing to the successes, the few successes that the leaders in the region accomplished. Resolution of the North Macedonia name issue, Montenegro's accession to NATO, progress in Albania towards European Union membership. So it's not that we are starting from zero. Still, while not wishing to be critical of the European Union, we have to recognize that helping countries on the road to Europe only has credibility if the road to Europe is open. And for several reasons, we can't say it is open at the moment. First, of course, there are 5 members of the European Union who do not recognize Kosovo's independence. Second, there's the well-documented reluctance of member states, a few member states in any instance, to meet promises either to Kosovo or to other countries in the region that were made on behalf of the European Union. There's a relatively new phenomenon of Bulgaria blocking North Macedonia's progress in a throwback to 19th century kinds of politics. And finally, there is the example of Hungary, which shows that a Potemkin democracy can still be a member of the European Union and give some encouragement to those leaders in the Balkans who have no interest in establishing a genuine democracy. But given all those blockages, what can the EU and the US do together? Well, one thing that I think they are doing reasonably well at the moment is to continue to state that we are not talking about border changes in the region, that those would be destabilizing. To continue to state that the goal of a Kosovo-Serbia dialogue has to be eventually mutual recognition. These don't have to be hammered onto the participants in the Balkans, but they need to be restated clearly and regularly. The US needs to be supportive of the European Union, of Brussels, of Mr. Lajcek, as they continue efforts in the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue. It's hard to be optimistic about how quickly that dialogue can achieve the ultimate goal of a complete agreement. But it is valuable to insist that the two parties continue to participate in the dialogue and to pursue more modest goals, goals that would have the effect both of making the daily life of the citizens of Serbia and Kosovo less onerous, more normal, and secondly, that also contribute to the building of rule of law requirements that ultimately will have to be met for European Union membership. So while it is, well, let me emphasize, it remains hard to think about what the breakthrough will be and when it will come. Without a realistic chance at EU membership in the near future, there is little incentive for Serbia's current government to make any progress. And in the face of that, it's realistic for the Kosovo leadership to treat the dialogue as a lower priority than the domestic issues that the new government is committed to confront. So what we can do that's positive, and I hope that the US administration will go this way, is to focus on one thing that's really new in the last few years, and that is a new government in Kosovo, not part of the wartime 1999 generation, so far untainted by corruption, and who has said that the rule of law and fighting corruption is the #1 priority of his government. In my wildest, most optimistic dreams, I would hope that Mr. Kurti could be a Nelson Mandela kind of figure who would focus on reconciliation within his country as the highest task. I don't know, Mr. Kurti, and perhaps that's utterly unrealistic, but more realistically, he can focus on fighting corruption, on establishing the rule of law, on generating a truly free media within Kosovo. Given the negative trend in Serbia and in other countries of the region, it's not impossible to imagine that Kosovo could surpass Serbia on some of these standards. So the US, together with the EU, can, at the minimum, and I hope they will make it a priority, support the civil society, support the non-governmental organizations that are working towards those goals and that have been hampered by the active hostility in Serbia and the passive hostility of governments in other countries. I've used up 10 minutes, so just a very quick word about Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's hard to be optimistic about Bosnia-Herzegovina as well. The best thing you can say about the year 2021 is that there are no elections scheduled anywhere in Bosnia this year. It opens an opportunity for the country's leadership to focus for once on the functionality, on governing, rather than simply campaigning. And while success will be hard to measure, there are a dozen small battles that need to be fought within Bosnia-Herzegovina with the support of Brussels and Washington to make particularly the federation more functional, more responsive to the needs and demands of its citizens. Let me stop there, and I look forward to first listening to Valerie and Ivan, and then to engaging in some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And indeed, you started with a very, very clear panning out of the issues in Southeast Europe at the moment. And we move now to Valerie to see, what your views are on these issues.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much to Ambassador Countryman for outlining so many of the issues that I hope I can also talk about. It's really a tremendous honor for me to be invited to this panel in the company of two other panelists and so many members of the audience who have such a long and deep experience in the region, much longer than mine. And it's a very nice way for me to cap my 11 years in the Balkans as I start to move on. And it's maybe one of the only times now that I will be unemployed and speak freely and not represent any employer. So that being said, I am a journalist and not somebody who has actually had to work to implement policy. So I will share how I see things from on the basis of my reporting, but I know that these can be the perspective from policymakers is also so important. And finally, before I start, I want to wish those of you watching who are tuning in from the region and elsewhere a happy Bayram if you're celebrating. So thanks for taking part of your Bayram for us. So I have been asked to speak about the opportunities for the US and Europe to work together and where they might converge and where they might diverge. And I think it's important, of course, to recognize that we shouldn't have extremely high expectations for a drastic increase in US engagement in the region. And as Ambassador Countryman said, the EU enlargement is also stalled. So I was in Washington actually this week meeting with, I can't let go of my former patch, so I was meeting with some of the ambassadors from these countries. And they were a bit worried about this kind of limbo that comes from a stalled EU enlargement and a Washington that cares, but can't necessarily prioritize what's happening in the region. So, but I think with some careful planning, the policy community and ambassadorial community can find a realistic approach. And the final thing I would like to say, just as a foundation for the discussion, is that we still don't really know what kind of approach the Biden administration will take towards neoliberalism within the European Union, especially in countries like Hungary, which is very active in the Balkans now, and of course Slovenia, which will take over the EU presidency. And my final article is coming out very soon, highlighting not only the that the damage, the potential damage from Slovenian government now is not only aggressive tweets and attacks on the media, but actually starting to dismantle and pressure, maybe dismantle is too strong, but to severely pressure some of the most important rule of law institutions in the country, like the audit court and the constitutional court. And finally, I think it's also important to remember that the U.S. has lost some credibility in the eyes of many of its European allies, especially Western European allies, some of which, you know, is building back and building back better, but some of which, you know, that will take some time. But I think that the Balkans can actually be a region and an issue where there can be a lot of agreement and can, you know, work and collaboration can help to repair that relationship. And I think that the EU would be wise to take advantage of that, because in several of these countries, especially in Bosnia and especially in Kosovo, the US is perceived as a more honest broker. So I think Washington should start to take on a key role in the process of appointing a new high representative in Bosnia, especially because you know, as Chancellor Merkel, who has been so personally engaged in the region, starts to wind down her commitment, her chancellorship, there will need to be somebody to kind of step in and fill that vacuum. And it's really, the German political landscape is looking very unclear. But until that happens, I think it would be great for Berlin to take very strong steps to encourage US engagement with BIH. You know, they're pushing for a new high rep, Christian Schmidt. And I think if Berlin goes and works very hard to persuade America and the other allies of the Quint about what his strategy might be, and that he starts with a very cogent and coherent and clear plan, that would help not only ensure support for his nomination, but also help to set a roadmap for this next period of BIH, which, as Ambassador Countryman said, is not really looking great. Regarding the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, this is another place, I think, where Washington can really help bring both sides back to the table. You know, it's been very clear for some time that there's growing frustration. Of course, Kosovo is still one of the most pro-EU countries in Europe, but there is still growing frustration with the EU over some of the gaffes that EU Special Representative Lajčák and his office have made with, you know, symbols, maps, meeting invitations, but also the continued lack of visa liberalization for Kosovo, which many years ago fulfilled all of its commitments. And I think this understanding and recognition, as Ambassador Countryman said, that this may not be the incoming president's top priority, and that Kosovo wants to be treated on equal footing with Serbia in terms of planning the meetings, setting the agenda for the topics of discussion. I think that needs to be understood. I think I don't know if in Brussels and to a lesser degree in Washington, there is like a full understanding of how grateful, of course, Kosovars are to Washington, but how frustrated they've been to perceive. I think, and this is especially for those who vote Stephendosia, but in general, those who perceive that their government must simply take dictated orders from Washington, whether that's in the best interest of the country or not. And I think, you know, that has I think been a big support for Stephendosia, and that's why Prime Minister Kurti is, I think, a part of the reason why he has been, you know, why he made this public refusal to travel to a meeting in Brussels with Serbian President Vučić on the 11th, this week actually, because you know, Vučić had already been invited and already confirmed, and it wasn't checked with him. These are small things, but I think that these are trust building things. I also think that you know, we saw that Washington's increased engagement in the dialogue did encourage Brussels to get moving on the dialogue process to appoint a special representative. But we saw, you know, that there was almost no communication there, not only between Brussels and Washington on that issue, but of course, even between Mr. Grinnell and top members of the State Department. So there was not a lot of coordination, and now is a great opportunity to foster that cooperation, to establish it, and to reassess. It's now been 10 years since the first technical agreements were signed between Belgrade and Pristina, and a number of them have not been implemented. Some like return of cadastral records, mutual recognition of diplomas, and these kind of issues which affect ordinary people. I think my impression, I spoke to a senior Serbian official this week who said, that their impression is that Special Representative Lajčák wants to achieve a big, fully, comprehensive second agreement on normalization, and that while if now is not really necessarily the time for that, which people seem to acknowledge, there could actually be some progress on issues like missing persons. And, I had the impression that there's quite a lot of will on the Serbian side to address missing persons, these cadastral records, the diplomas, and as Ambassador Countryman said, if you're hoping to see Prime Minister Kurti take some steps to reconciliation, I think that these types of moves, which do affect ordinary people, Serbs who have graduated, Serbs who want to remain in Kosovo but graduated from Serbian language university in Serbia or elsewhere, deserve, or in North Mitrovica, which is not part of that agreement, deserve these basic ability to have a livelihood and have their diplomas recognized. And I think these kinds of confidence building measures would go far. And I think the US is in a good position to encourage that. I think, as Ambassador Countryman said as well, fighting corruption is the cornerstone now of Albin Kurti's premiership. At least it's been announced, and it is quite interesting that somebody who dedicated so much of his time and energy to combating the UN missions and the EU rule of law mission wants now to bring EU judges to assist in a vetting process for members of the Kosovo judiciary. And I think that perhaps there can also be American assistance there. And there always was a big American presence in ULEX, and I think that this is something that Kosovo would really like. What else? We haven't yet touched on, and maybe Ivan will talk about this, the growing push for a regional economic area. I think it's very interesting because from what I understand, Prime Minister Kurti speaks publicly against it, but privately his administration is actually moving forward with implementing some of the measures, most of which amount to de facto, if not de jure, recognition of Kosovo. And there's a lot of support coming from high-level officials to this end, but what I still haven't seen are the real economic arguments about how much it can benefit the region. And I think the US could help in kind of commissioning such studies or finding this kind of data in order to sell it to citizens who are otherwise skeptical and worried that it may not be a boon for their economy. I'm starting to run out of time as well. I think another thing that Ambassador Countryman said is assistance towards helping North Macedonia and Albania move forward with their accession negotiations. I think it's possible that now with a change in government in Bulgaria, we will see this possibly being lifted, but until Bulgaria has the new elections, perhaps the US can apply some leverage, because it really continues to send the wrong message when North Macedonia and now Albania as well cannot move forward in the negotiations. And finally, I think that the US and the EU have a very mutual interest in assessing and monitoring and combating the growing Chinese presence in the region, especially in Serbia, but also in Montenegro, where we've seen that the new government has asked for assistance in repaying a loan that was taken on very bad terms from China to build their new highway. And I think that opening these kind of discussions or deepening them, continuing them, is a serious point of convergence. So I'm looking forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for addressing your views, some of the points that Tom mentioned already, and expanded also into the economic remit. And now we go to Ivan and to see what his views are. And in particular, we would like to ask Ivan, what about democracy promotion, and not just in the Western Balkans, Ivan, but also if you want to expand more widely in Slovenia, in other parts of Eastern Europe, you are best positioned to discuss about do we have any expectations on that?
Thank you very much, both to Elaine and you, Othon, for this invitation, and to be in the great company of Valerie and Tom. Much to say, and I think it's very good that we're focusing on this issue. Let me start, strangely enough, and bear with me, 17 years ago, in July 2004, I was invited for the first time to testify in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the United States Senate. Presiding was the late Senator George Voinovich, and he was there together with a certain senator called Joseph Biden. The title of the Senate hearing was U.S. Policy Towards Southeastern Europe, Unfinished Business in the Balkans. So here we are 17 years later, it's still unfinished business, although we've been around the block many times, addressing all these issues, which Tom laid out extremely well, and Valerie as well. We are still in unfinished business in US parlance until Europe is whole, free, and at peace. And I like to call this region the Inner Courtyard. Many talk about the fringes, the marches, the periphery of Europe. No, we are inside the garden, so to speak. We are surrounded completely, the 6 countries of the Western Balkans, by full European Union and NATO members. And in fact, we have 3 full NATO members in this region, Albania, Montenegro, and latest, the 30th member of NATO is North Macedonia. 3 thus countries are not members, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Serbia, but we have NATO present in Kosovo and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to remind those who don't know all the niceties of our region. And of course, Serbia, for the moment at least, has opted to remain neutral and not to join, but has a full IPAP, Individual Partnership Action Plan program. And what many people don't realize, Serbia does roughly 9 to 10 times more exercises with NATO than with any other country, including Russia, although exercises with Russia get all the headlines. There's also a variety of forms of regional cooperation and security. For example, the Adriatic Charter that was initiated by the US, where all countries are either members or observers. So regular meetings of mill to mill, also through the Regional Cooperation Council that is based in Sarajevo, meetings of intelligence chiefs and the like. So I think it's important to remind people of the intensity of regional contacts and of contacts, obviously, with the European Union and the United States. I fully agree with and subscribe to what Tom said about the state of the US approach to the Western Balkans. Not much has dramatically changed over these 17 or more years since the fall of Milosevic, basically, when the region opened up to a democratic transition through Serbia, then becoming one of the active proponents of that. And I think that the fact that we have a US administration that is well versed in the Balkans, as I mentioned, and you all know, Joe Biden has been involved since the times of the Bosnian conflict. Tony Blinken, as his advisor, as vice president, was very involved in meeting with regional leaders or advisors. Victoria Nuland as well, and now Karen Donfried as the assistant secretary for the region, all know the region very well. So I think that bodes well in terms of knowledge of the issues and problems and engagements. To put it simply, I think we need more geopolitical and geo-economic engagement. When I say geopolitical, I'm talking more about the European Union because the Commission has proclaimed itself. And again, all too simply, I think the European Union, although committed fully to the enlargement of the Western Balkans, took its eye off the ball during a certain period, which allowed for the so-called euphemistically third actors, the Russias, Chinas, the Turks, and Emiratis to come in. One of the problems, and that's why I mentioned the importance of geoeconomics, is that all of these countries need infrastructure investment badly. The fact that these investments were not coming from the West allowed space for the China especially to come in. And yet, when you look at the comparative figures of US and in particular EU investments, they are incomparable to anything that China or Russia have put into any of these countries. And I think it's very significant to underline that, which doesn't mean to neglect or underestimate the role that China and Russia, as a spoiler, have in the Euro-Atlantic movement of the region. And that is something I think that has brought us to a wake-up moment, both in the European Union and the US. And witness to that is the statement of the G7 foreign minister just a week ago, where there's a section on the Western Balkans, which is worth reading, and that talks about the need for enhanced engagement, that sort of reiterates the points that both Tom and Valerie have made on the need to support the normalization process between Serbia and Kosovo, on fighting corruption, and it actually bodes for a more robust engagement on egregious crimes and corruption in the region. Let me state the obvious for those of us who are aware of this, but the American Drug Enforcement Agency has an office in Belgrade, is active in the region in fighting crime for many years now, as is the Serious Organized Crimes Unit of the United Kingdom. So fighting corruption and the emphasis on democracy are something that the new Biden administration brings back in a reinforced manner. And I think that is extremely important. And that comes through also statements that have been made not only by the G7, as I mentioned, but also by the European Union through the High Rep Borrell, who in meeting President Vučić, for example, 2 weeks ago in Brussels, emphasized very clearly advancement on rule of law, alignment with EU foreign policy, and normalization with Kosovo. So I think, and this is where the benefit of the new administration in Washington is for the region and for those of us all who have been and keep fighting for democracy, for greater civil society space, and for more media freedoms, will, I hope, give benefit. Since time is running out and there are more things to say, I would like to add that the issue of Bulgaria stopping North Macedonia, I speak very frankly, I find obnoxious. It is extremely detrimental to the credibility of the European Union, to the Euro-Atlantic path from an EU and NATO member. But let's not forget that it was France that stopped North Macedonia first, back in October 2019, which after the historic compromise achieved between Greece and North Macedonia was something that should have been acknowledged. I don't use the word rewarded. There's nothing to reward here. It has to be acknowledged that that opened the path for North Macedonia to move forward. And the talk of decoupling Albania from North Macedonia, I think, is also very detrimental. And we fortunately had a strong statement from Borrell that this was unacceptable. Let's just hope that pressure can be brought to bear and reason can prevail on this issue and allow the next step for these countries. Also, I think, and this is important to mention, for all of us, but also from where I come from, that I find it very detrimental that Kosovo has not yet received a visa-free regime with the European Union. The only country of the region. Countries like Ukraine and Moldova have visa-free regimes. I don't think it helps us move forward if the people of Kosovo are not feeling at the same level, and Valerie was mentioning that, on something that is seen as one of the best pieces that a country can acquire on its road to Euro-Atlantic membership. And I finish here by reiterating that I'm hoping that I'm recognizing this wake up in both Washington and Brussels and in the member states, and thus leadership from countries like Germany and France and Washington, but others as well, can help us move to the next step towards finishing the unfinished business.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And Elaine has allowed me throughout a chat conversation to just ask a follow-up question to each one of you based on your presentation so far. So I would like to ask Tom first, what about the Russian danger for the United States? Is that something real? Is it in terms of military security issues? Is it, through the means of disinformation? Where is the fear exactly of Russia in the Western Balkans? I would like to ask Valerie on the Slovenian illiberalism that you suggested, which is very much a trend that we have been seeing and we're all worrying. How do you think the European Union should address the fact that Slovenia is taking the presidency in the next 6 months? Is that a risk, a danger, an opportunity? I mean, how should the EU address this? And finally, Ivan, I would like to ask you whether on the EU side, whether you are convinced that the emphasis on the rule of law in the Western Balkans, as has been addressed in the new enlargement approach, is that something convincing? Will it work? Or will they give emphasis again on the geopolitics of the region and will have to downplay that side of the story? Thank you.
Okay, well, let me take a shot at that. First, as a more global issue, I'm a little bit frustrated by the obsession in Washington with defining the current foreign policy challenge as being great power competition. In my view, the defining challenge of this era is the fragility of our natural, human, and democratic systems, and how we are not doing enough to address those questions, which are more urgent even than the security questions subsumed under great power competition. Now, specifically in terms of Russian influence in the Balkans, the primary threat is not a security or a military threat. The primary effect of deep Russian engagement is to retard any progress that the states can make towards European Union membership. The effect of Vučić implementing Putinism with a human face in Serbia, that is complete control of the media and of elections, is to move him backwards from achieving the standards of rule of law and free media that would allow Serbia to move closer to the European Union. And that is a personal plus for Vučić and his party. It is a negative for the citizens of Serbia. And it is directly contrary to what I said was the primary goal. We could talk a little more about what you can do to continue to counter that influence, which we should be trying to do. But let me keep the first answer brief.
Thank you, Tom. Valerie.
Well, thank you for this million-dollar question. My piece is my forthcoming piece is merely posing that question rather than pretending to have any answers. But I think that I was quite surprised myself in as I reported it, because for the last 3 years, although I've been covering the Balkans, I've been living in Hungary and watching the way that trying to understand the way that Prime Minister Viktor Orban has used the legal system there to legally sort of take control over not only the media but also the courts and many, I don't know, many institutions. Slovenia is in a much different situation because, of course, they have elections next year. The government was formed by a bunch of parties which have been cobbled together to avoid another election. Many of those parties will not win next year, and there's no supermajority. But that being said, I was quite surprised about what I could see as the damage that even with those conditions is being done. So it's not only that Prime Minister Janša is tweeting at journalists and fomenting mistrust and disgust with the media. He's also, altered the laws to defund the state broadcasting agency, in the process of writing new laws governing all broadcasting, and the radio and other media. And also a pattern that we see in both Hungary and Serbia, using public companies like the state telecom to pump money into media that report or publish, I don't know if I want to say report even, that publish news favorable to the government and that provides the government with favorable coverage. So we see this ongoing now in Serbia, an ongoing battle between United Group and media that are being purchased and supported by the state telecom. Yesterday, I think in Slovenia, I got an email from a professor that the telecom Slovenia stopped the sale of a media company to United Group, I believe, and it looks like it will sell to a company, a Hungarian TV2 owned by allies of Viktor Orban, for a much lower price. I'm trying to remember now if it's that the price is maybe higher than the fair market price that United Group was willing to pay. So we've seen that in Serbia. Of course, there's all kinds of models in Hungary, and I think that if there's one thing maybe that Brussels can do, I don't know that this can happen in time for the EU presidency, but the Commission can investigate these kind of media sales or do research about it. The European Parliament can publicize the research about how the media market in all of these countries, which are learning from each other, is being distorted. Beyond that, that has been a very tricky question for Brussels as they try to deal with Poland and Hungary. Article 7 procedures have proved to be fairly toothless because they are targeting both of them at the same time and they can protect one another from these proceedings. Orban finally jumped before he was pushed from the European People's Party, which Janša's party is also, Slovenian Prime Minister Janša's party is also a part of. And I don't think I've heard a peep from anyone in the EPP leadership raising concern about, and maybe I've missed it, but perhaps there could be a bigger discussion. But considering that the European People's Party lost the 11 Fidesz representatives, perhaps it's not ready to take on Janša's party, even though I think its representation is quite small. Sorry that I don't have a better or more optimistic answer, but yeah, continuing to prioritize rule of law or encouraging Slovenia. Slovenia, I think, is their priorities for their EU presidency are technological cybersecurity and preserving and promoting our European way of life. And this at a time when an unprecedented amount of money is being distributed through the recovery fund and the new budget. So perhaps there could be more encouragement there or more statements. But statements are, we've heard all of us who've spent any time in the Balkans have heard a lot of statements that don't necessarily go anywhere. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie. And Ivan?
Yes, as briefly as I can, you're absolutely right that the rule of law is of paramount importance. And as I said, there's been a sort of an awakening to the need to push more convincingly on these issues. In terms of Serbia, President Vučić has been in a ruling coalition for nearly 9 years now. And the way that the European Union is speaking up, and I repeat the statement by the G7 just the other day, and probably a stronger statement from the full G7 meeting in the UK will come forward with this. As those of you who deal with this, the term stabilocracy has been used, that rather the West preferred stability with the hope that problems like Kosovo, Serbia relations would be solved, and thus turning a blind eye to the lack or regression of democratic practices. I think that time has changed. For example, on the Serbia-Kosovo issue, we have two, how can I put it, very strong parliaments in terms of ruling coalitions. And there's been a statement that since both ruling parties, both in Kosovo of Albin Kurti and of President Vučić, can now basically vote anything they want, why don't they move forward using the example of Greece and North Macedonia, showing leadership in resolving a key issue? Do they want, I like to say, a situation like India and Pakistan and have Kashmir unresolved for 70 years? Yeah, I mean, we can all live with the status quo, but that is very unhealthy and not in the European spirit, although everyone has declared strategic goals to join the European Union. So let's demonstrate the European values that we supposedly want. And that joins the theme that Valerie was addressing, the freedom of the media. Not that we can't inform ourselves. You know, in a country like Serbia, you have weeklies that are independent, you have cable news that is very critical of the regime. What we're really talking about is the public broadcasters, the ones that have the greatest audience with the 8 o'clock news in the evening. And the opposition does not stand a chance to break through that firewall of the 8 o'clock news on the public broadcaster. The European Parliament is now mediating a discussion between the governing party and the opposition. Will that give a breakthrough into the public broadcaster? You know, there's a lot of skepticism on that, but we'll see. But certainly, I think that this is now going to be really something. It's been acknowledged by, for example, President Vučić, but as Valerie has said, I mean, the fact that we have full members of the European Union and NATO, such as Hungary and Poland, where democracy has backslid in such dramatic ways, is not helping those in the candidate countries who are fighting for a normal society of political pluralism, legality, and a public space that is fully open.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And Elaine, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to our speakers for this very engaging discussion. I must confess, as I thought about today's event, I fell victim to a certain bit of nostalgia for the early 2000s and the exuberance that we felt when Ivan and so many of his colleagues in Serbia ousted Milosevic. There was so much promise and so much hope. And I found myself reviewing the lecture of the late Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić, which he gave at Harvard almost 20 years ago, where he compared Serbia's democratic trajectory to riding a bicycle. And he said, and I quote, "A bicycle can be stable only by moving. If you stop or look down at your legs, you will fall down. The only way to stay on track and not fall down is to keep moving." I really couldn't help but think about asking Ivan to share his thoughts specifically on Serbia and Serbia's democratic trajectory. We see now the Biden administration preparing to mobilize a broad coalition of democratic governments by putting together a summit of democracies. Has the concept of democratization changed? Do we need to rethink the definition? And can you be a little bit candid, Ivan, about Serbia's democratic trajectory from those days of exuberance to where we find ourselves today?
Thank you, Elaine, for that question. Well, I sort of answered a bit in my previous response. It's been a roller coaster with very high hopes, and thank you for reminding us of those heady days. And then, of course, the democratization process hit the rocks of reality, and that all of these processes of opening up what used to be a communist country that went through 10 years of war, that inherited after the political fall of Milosevic, a criminalized country and a criminalized society, lots to dig through to kind of come up for air. Lots of support from the European Union and the United States at that time. But then, you know, what those of us who deal in political theory and practice know, democracy is a plant that takes time to put down its roots. And, you know, you can vote in the institutions and the laws, but then the democratic political culture simply takes time. I would like to add something I think that we're all aware of but haven't mentioned, is the demographic challenge. Lots of people leaving our countries, and not only ours, but Romania, Bulgaria, and others. We're losing a younger part of the population, the aging and thus more conservative people voting. All this ties in to the issues that, for example, our friend and colleague Ivan Krastev is writing a book about. And I think we have to factor that in. And of course, the numbers are diminishing in Bosnia, in Albania, everywhere else. So we're also losing a kind of social capital. The fabric of society is being diminished in those processes. But since everyone is declared that they want to be democratic, and that's to your question, has, you know, democratization, is there a different view? No, basically, I think nothing changes for those of us who believe in a democratic and open society, and that is, you know, the basic freedoms and the rights and the rule of law. And that is what we as citizens in civil society and courageous investigative journalists are fighting for, to uncover all the misdeeds of our governments and the various regional corporations, the bad ones as well, between organized crime. And that's where we need help from the outside, which has been there, but I think needs to be reinforced.
Thank you, Ivan. We have many questions that have come in from the Q&A. I hope we can get to all of them, and with your permission, if we can, if we don't, maybe we can just go a couple minutes over. There's a question on Prime Minister Kurti's objectives on fighting corruption and strengthening the rule of law and democratic governance in Kosovo. These are ambitious and essential for Kosovo and the Western Balkan regions, the questioner notes. What is the scope of policy and financial resources that the Biden administration is willing to invest to support Kurti's crusade? Tom, would you like to hazard a response?
Yes, a guess. You were about to say a guess, and that's all I can do. First, I would note that since 1999, U.S. technical support through the Agency for International Development and through the presence of U.S. law enforcement experts in Kosovo has been substantial. It has been a priority for as long as Kosovo has been self-governing. Can it be expanded? And should it be expanded? I think the answer to both questions is yes. There needs to be not just a US effort, but a coordinated US-European Union effort to support rule of law reforms and anti-corruption initiatives in Kosovo. This is as essential for the stability of Kosovo in the region as is the dialogue itself. And so I hope to see support not just for the government, but for the NGOs that are making this a primary issue. And I think this also touches on a good question from Pierre Mirel about can the European Union and the US together earmark or tie specific funding for infrastructure and other projects to progress in the rule of law and in fighting corruption. It is a difficult thing to do, but it is necessary to try and to say very openly that the United States and the European Union together are putting their money in the places where investments have the best chance of actually improving people's lives instead of being diverted into politicians' pockets. That's what we ought to do together. One more quick point about US and European cooperation. There needs to be a very clear rule between Brussels and Washington of no surprises. We don't go and make separate comments to the leaders of the region without telling the other partner in Brussels or in Washington what we're about to say. I think that's fairly essential if we're going to have any success, even marginal success in the region.
Thank you. There's a question asking, do we need new mechanisms to tie together EU and US efforts, prevent attempts from the region to exploit perceived defenses and counteract the negative influence of Russia, for example? Valerie, would you like to address that question?
I could try. New mechanisms. I mean, I am not somebody who has spent a lot of time in boardrooms coming up with new policy tools or new initiatives. I think now it's a big opportunity to just revitalize the relationship that was strained. I mean, we saw, for instance, last year the Washington agreements, or now I believe the proper term is Washington commitments, since they weren't agreements, that were the separate agreement signed between Washington and Kosovo and Washington and Belgrade, which was very clearly, in addition to providing a White House summit and achieving some strategic objectives, also really focused on countering Chinese influence. I don't know, in the past, the U.S. and I think both Tom and Ivan know this better than I do, but in the past, the U.S. had and was always present, for instance, during most meetings in Brussels for the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. I don't know now at what level, which is a very specific thing, but I don't know now at what level somebody from the State Department is present now in meetings, trilateral meetings. I think it's more just the need to continue to reestablish those connections and to continue to collaborate and to be present, right? I mean, for reasons, many of which are obvious to us, we did not see the U.S. participating in the same level of vaccine diplomacy that China and Russia participated in, and most people, I think, in the Balkans were more focused on delays from COVAX or frustration with the EU. But Serbian President Vučić won a lot of plaudits, a lot of support, repaired a lot of ties with neighboring countries. I mean, I personally bumped into, tens of people from Sarajevo alone that were in Belgrade getting vaccinated, that were genuinely grateful that not only to Serbia, but also to China and to Russia for distributing vaccines. And I'm very happy that, I'm in the States now, and I'm very happy to see that things are returning to normal, that many people have been vaccinated, and that now America is starting to share vaccines. But that was a time when the U.S. was simply not present and created a vacuum for China and Russia to spread their influence. So I do think that both parties will need to sit now together and think about these very concrete ways, because of course, vaccines, image pictures of Vučić kissing the Chinese flag don't necessarily compete with the tremendous amount of investment, financial support with no strings attached that is coming from the EU. But better ways to publicize what is already being done, I think, are sorely needed.
Thank you, Valerie. This seems to be quite a theme in our questions, the rise of the influence of China, Russia, Turkey, the Emirates. We've touched upon this a little bit in our discussion today, but I wonder if Ivan and or Tom want to add anything.
If I may, just a few sentences on this previous topic to state the obvious for many of us, but there are people on this call that need to be simply reminded. The so-called normalization and comprehensive agreement between Serbia and Kosovo does not happen without the United States and the European Union working hand in hand. The United States has always been at the table. It is not seen in all the photos for obvious reasons, and Tom can testify to that. But I think with the new administration, there will be a renewed push for that. Speaking frankly, the US has much more leverage, if that's the polite word, in Pristina and Kosovo, and obviously, I mean, the European Union and US together in Serbia. It will, I repeat, require leadership and statesmanship on both sides. As I said, both sides have full majorities of sorts in their polities, so I think that works well. I agree with Pierre Mirel, and Tom alluded to that the EU more generally needs to be more proactive geoeconomically with structural funds. And let's just say one of the good things that came out of the September Washington agreement under President Trump's aegis was the opening of the United States International Development Finance Corporation office in Belgrade, apparently the first one abroad, that includes Greece and other countries in the region, simply an office that helps investments, public and private investments into things like infrastructure. So again, a proactive US move that I hope this administration will carry forward. As far as the influence of the so-called third actors, I said at the beginning, you need to look at the numbers. The EU is by far, outweighs anything that these countries do. Tom and I stressed the fact that Russia is a spoiler. They will try to stop and retard the Euro-Atlantic movement of the region. Anyone in Moscow looks at the geographic map and knows where this belongs, but they want to show the weakness of the European Union and of the Euro-Atlantic by making this happen. Of course, countries like Serbia give space to the Sputniks, the Russian radio, and apparently there are Chinese media that are moving in. But you travel through Frankfurt Airport and there are Chinese media adverts as you walk through the halls and to the gates. And just one small thing that our friend Misha Glenny has corrected me. It is not the UK Serious Organized Crime Agency. It is now the National Crime Agency of the UK.
Well, Misha ought to know with all of his work on this topic. Tom, would you like to give any feedback?
Well, on the couple of points that Ivan just mentioned, first, when Robert Cooper began the first Kosovo-Serbia dialogue in 2011, I was in the room as a not so silent observer. It is not necessary for the dialogue to be a EU-US co-sponsorship. There are many different formulas you could use, but for the US not to be intimately involved in Mr. Lajcik's planning and conduct of the dialogue is a formula for failure. Not that the chances of success are immediately very high, but you want to give your best chance of success and recognize that the United States has greater credibility and influence in Kosovo today than the European Union does. That may or may not be fair, but it is a reality. In terms of influence of other countries in the region, again, it's hard to accept the focus on China as a strategic adversary in Washington right now. It is a little bit of an obsession in both parties, and it will spill over into the way countries approach other regions, the way the US approaches other parts of the world and other topics as well. What concerns me about particularly Chinese influence in the region is not so much the debt. There are, after all, important infrastructure needs in the region, and if they can be met in a way that serve both the interests of the countries of the region and of China, then those infrastructure projects ought to be built. What concerns me when China signs such economic agreements, whether it's with Serbia or Iran is the most recent case, is that the experience we already have in Serbia and in countries of the Middle East and Africa is that these deals are not transparent. They do not serve the purpose of anti-corruption. They do involve kickbacks to government officials, and they largely ignore environmental standards that are important to the local citizens. The same is true to a greater or lesser extent of Russian and Turkish and Emirati investment as well. So the answer is not to condemn countries that are interested in economic dealings, investment, or trade with the region, but rather to help empower citizens and their governments to insist on clean, transparent economic dealings with partners from the US, European Union, or anywhere else in the world.
Thank you. I'd like to table a question from one of our Harvard undergraduate students, Taylor, who has had a long interest in Southeastern Europe and who has really pushed us to think about doing an event such as the one we're doing today. And Taylor asks, what specific steps can the Biden administration take to help make constitutional reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina possible? We have a related question on how serious are the risks of a breakdown in BIH and what is a realistic way forward to avoid them? Who would like to take this question? Eva?
Well, let me take a shot at that. Something that those of us who come from the former Yugoslavia, from whichever part, when the whole catastrophe started at the beginning of the 90s, and when we saw what was about to happen, we all said that somehow it would all end, and the last piece of the puzzle to be solved would be in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because to speak shorthand, Bosnia and Herzegovina is the mini Yugoslavia. Where there is a cohabitation or consociational agreement for those who are into political sociology between three peoples, Croats, Bosniaks, and Serbs, and of course minorities, if that's the right word. So sort of the long view is that Bosnia will be the last to fall into place. I want to come back to the beginning about the non-papers and all this frankly irresponsible, to put it weakly, talk about border changes. That is no. I mean, that is really unhelpful, to say the least. This will not happen. There will not be a war in the region. Unfortunately, we did war in the 90s, and there is total fatigue with anything so dramatic. That is not to say that there aren't politicians who are playing with fire by talking about separation, border changes, etc. And thankfully, again, the G7, I come back to the ministerial, they expressly said, don't play with fire, no border changes, etc. And I think those of us who are here present fully subscribe to that. Not that there weren't ideas of that sort in the back rooms of policy making, capitals in the world, as any state, plans those things, but that is off the table. And the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina is key. And I guess, Marko Prelic was asking, is Bosnia and Herzegovina about to fall, and what happens there? I don't think it will. It will muddle through is maybe too strong a word for that, but there's been a cozy agreement between the elites that govern Bosnia and Herzegovina, who thump their chest before the election in an ethnic way and get reelected. Things are slowly changing, maybe all too slowly for the eye of the observer. And thus it will require an engagement, a kind of hand-holding, if you will, from the European Union and the United States to sort of move that country along. But again, if the other countries don't move, they won't have the pulling effect on Bosnia and Herzegovina. The best example of that was when the countries of Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia got a visa-free regime from Brussels. Suddenly, the Bosnian leadership, in 8 months' time, was able to, pack everything together and fulfill the requirements. And then, if I may add, to come back to this issue of corruption, that is, from what I gather, reading the statements of the Biden administration, corruption will be an issue. And I do recall, and I believe it was on Tom Countryman's watch, that before Croatia joined the European Union, I think we were even together on that day when Prime Minister Sanader was arrested on the border between Slovenia and Austria, trying to run away from his obligations. So again, Croatia had to do something quite drastic to demonstrate that it was worthy of joining the European Union.
Thank you, Ivan. Before I draw our session to a close, we've gone over. I just want to ask if Valerie or Tom might have any closing thoughts that they wanted to share.
I could leave you with a pessimistic thought, or maybe some might see it as positive. And I should have prepared a graphic to illustrate this. This is my prediction for the shape of the European Union in the year 2050. And I intend to still be around in 2050, so write it down and check with me then to see how accurate it is. My prediction is that the map of the European Union will include nearly every country west of the Black Sea, including Switzerland, Norway, Scotland, and Wales, and that the only gaps will be England, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and maybe Hungary.
That's definitely a glass half full or empty scenario. We'll leave it for our viewers to decide. Valerie or Ivan, any last parting words? Valerie.
We can let Ivan finish. I've just written it down. I'm going to call you in 2050 when hopefully I'll still be working for the New York Times and check in about that. I'm not so pessimistic about Hungary, I have to say, despite everything I said before, but that's a topic for another time. I don't have something so drastic and so sweeping, I think. Thank you very much for having me. And I think it's just, I don't know, I hope that soon these discussions will not focus on the same topics as Ivan mentioned, the unfinished business hearing so many 2 decades ago. Yeah, thank you. Ivan, why don't you give us a more poetic closing?
Just one additional thought, Elaine and Othon, I think that is worthy of mention and that we're all obviously aware of, but I think needs to be repeated. And that is the role of private foundations in the region. The Open Society Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers, the Charles Stewart Mott, the German Marshall Fund, Kokalis that brought us to Harvard. These have had a very important role in bringing forth habits of democracy, if I can put it, through supporting civil society independent media, regional cooperation, and they continue their work. And they're a very important dimension of kind of US, Western Balkans, EU, Western Balkans relations. I think that needs to be underscored.
Thank you, Ivan. And thanks to all of our speakers, and thanks to Othon Anastasakis and all of his talented and dedicated colleagues at CSOX for helping us bring this event together. I think it's really a testament to the strength of interest in the region among our Oxford and Harvard colleagues, and by the very diverse audience that has joined us from around the world. To just note that usually in Zoom webinars, you see participants numbers dropping as you get halfway through the event, but throughout this event, our numbers just kept going up and staying steady. So thank you to all the speakers for your engaging thoughts. Thank you to all of the participants who have joined us, not only for this event, but throughout the year. This event brings our lecture series to a close. At Harvard, CSOX, you're still in the middle of a term, so tune in to CSOX for additional events on Southeastern Europe. It was a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope we may all come together again, even via Zoom, to continue to discuss these topics.
Thank you.